At the funeral, a canine dog leaped onto the veteran's body. What followed brought tears to every eye. The silence inside the chapel was almost unbearable. Only the faint rustling of black clothing and muffled sobs filled the heavy air. The scent of lilies mingled with the oppressive weight of grief, pressing down on the shoulders of everyone who had gathered to honor Sergeant Marcus Thompson. Marcus wasn't just a soldier, he was a hero, a leader, a protector. Someone who had survived explosions, ambushes, and freezing desert nights, only to end up here in a polished dark oak casket beneath stained glass windows that painted the aisle in pale shades of dawn. Atop the casket, carefully placed, lay a neatly folded American flag, a symbol of duty, honor, and sacrifice. Yet, for those who knew Marcus, especially his sister Margaret Thompson, none of this seemed fair. Margaret sat in the front pew, clutching a damp tissue between trembling fingers. She was the image of quiet strength collapsing under the unbearable loss. Marcus had been a survivor. He had faced explosions, ambushes, and nights so cold they'd frozen men's spirits, and yet somehow, he had always returned home. But this time, fate had different plans. One mission had robbed Margaret of a brother and robbed the soldiers present of their comrade. Standing stoically at the entrance, holding his leash taut, was Rex, a German Shepherd canine. Rex's breathing was rapid, his body rigid with anxiety, as though he understood something terrible had happened, yet couldn't grasp the full scope of the loss. Rex had served with Marcus for 3 years, navigating minefields, detecting explosives, and saving countless lives alongside him. But now confusion clouded his deep brown eyes as he scanned the chapel, searching frantically for his handler. Then Rex's gaze fell upon the casket. The dog froze, ears pricked forward, eyes locked on Marcus's still figure. Then, without warning, he broke free from the officer holding him. His nails clicked sharply against the polished floor as he sprinted toward the aisle. Before anyone could stop him, Rex leaped into the casket. Gasps filled the room as the dog landed gently inside, nudging Marcus's unmoving shoulder as if signaling him to get up, just as he'd done countless times on the battlefield. But Marcus didn't respond. Rex whimpered, low and mournful, a sound heavy with sorrow. He curled his body around Marcus's chest, sniffing frantically, desperately seeking a sign of life, but finding none. Slowly, Rex rested his head on Marcus's shoulder, letting out a mournful whimper. A ripple of grief spread through the chapel, touching every heart present. Margaret's breath caught, her chest tightening as she watched Rex's heartbreaking devotion. She moved toward the casket, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "He doesn't understand. He thinks Marcus is going to wake up." A chaplain gently stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Margaret's shoulder. "He's grieving too. Let him say goodbye." Rex didn't move, his deep brown eyes staring into the empty space near Marcus. Margaret followed his gaze, but there was nothing visible, just a chilling emptiness. The chaplain murmured softly, "Sometimes dogs see what we cannot." A hushed silence settled over the chapel, heavy with questions and grief, and yet strangely comforting. No one dared interrupt Rex's final farewell. Rex lay motionless, curled protectively beside Marcus Thompson's lifeless body. The chapel remained still, grief hanging thickly in the air. But Margaret found herself drifting backward through memories of Marcus before he was Sergeant Thompson, before medals and uniforms and ceremonies, when he was simply her big brother, her protector, her best friend. Marcus had grown up in a modest home in rural Georgia, surrounded by fields and winding dirt roads. Their parents instilled in them a powerful sense of dignity and pride, reminding them daily of the strength that ran through their veins. Marcus, tall and strong even as a teenager, had always carried himself with a quiet authority, the kind that made others naturally look up to him. Margaret smiled faintly, remembering how Marcus had taught her to ride a bike down those dusty country roads, always running beside her, reassuring her that he would never let her fall. His dreams had always been bigger than their small town. He dreamt of honor, duty, and service to something bigger than himself. Joining the military was Marcus's way of honoring those dreams. It wasn't easy at first. Training pushed him to his limits, physically and mentally, but Marcus's resilience set him apart. His determination quickly moved him up the ranks, and soon he was leading missions, inspiring soldiers with his quiet courage and calm strength. Then came Rex. Marcus had been hesitant about working with a canine partner initially. He worried he might not have the patience or the gentle touch required. Yet when Marcus met Rex, a sharp, disciplined, yet affectionate German shepherd, everything changed. Margaret remembered clearly how Marcus's eyes lit up the first time he spoke of Rex. "There's just something special about him," Marcus had said during a phone call home. "We understand each other. It's like he knows what I'm thinking even before I do." Their bond deepened rapidly. Rex wasn't just Marcus's partner, he was his shadow, his protector, his family in the chaos of war. The pair became inseparable, with stories of their bravery spreading throughout the platoon. Marcus often credited Rex with saving his life, recounting moments when the canine had sniffed out danger just in time. Margaret never forgot the story Marcus shared about a mission overseas. They were clearing a building suspected of housing insurgents. Marcus stepped through a doorway, and without warning, Rex slammed into him, knocking him down. Moments later, the doorway exploded from an improvised explosive device. Marcus came out shaken but unharmed, thanks entirely to Rex. From that moment, Marcus never doubted Rex. He knew their partnership was built on trust, deeper than words could convey. But Marcus didn't just talk about Rex's bravery. He also spoke about quiet moments, long, freezing desert nights, the two sitting shoulder to shoulder under starry skies. Marcus would confide in Rex, sharing his dreams, fears, and hopes about the future. "He listens better than most people I know," Marcus often joked. Now, as Margaret stood in the chapel, those memories felt both painfully distant and impossibly vivid. Marcus had promised to come home, to retire someday, buy a small house by a lake, and spend lazy afternoons fishing with Rex at his feet. That was the future they deserved. Margaret wiped away a tear, her eyes drifting back to Rex, still lying faithfully inside the casket. He hadn't moved since he jumped up beside Marcus. She could see the gentle rise and fall of Rex's chest, steady but filled with sorrow, as though each breath carried a heavy question. Why won't he wake up? The chaplain stepped closer, noticing Margaret's struggle. His voice was gentle. "Sometimes it helps to talk about him." Margaret nodded slowly, swallowing hard. "Marcus always told me Rex was special. He saved his life more times than I can count. I just wish," her voice trailed off, thick with emotion, "I wish Rex didn't have to feel this loss." She reached out, placing her hand softly on Rex's fur. He twitched slightly but didn't flinch. She continued speaking softly, as though Rex himself could understand every word. "He loved you, boy, more than you'll ever know." Suddenly, the silence in the chapel shifted. Rex lifted his head slightly, ears twitching, as if recalling those battlefield conversations, those quiet whispers of camaraderie and trust. For a brief moment, his deep brown eyes seemed to hold understanding, as though Margaret's words had reached some deep, hidden place inside him. Sergeant Jameson, a veteran soldier who served closely with Marcus overseas, approached Margaret carefully, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. He spoke in a gentle tone. "Your brother saved my life more than once. I owe him everything." Margaret turned to Jameson, her voice filled with quiet strength. "Thank you for being here. Marcus always spoke highly of you." Jameson offered a respectful nod, his gaze moving back to Rex. "And your brother talked about Rex like he was family. I've seen him in action, braver than half the men I've served with. That dog is loyalty in its purest form." Margaret's eyes filled with tears again, this time from gratitude and pride. The truth was clear to everyone present. Rex wasn't merely a service dog. He was Marcus's brother-in-arms, a steadfast guardian, and a true member of their family. Yet despite these powerful moments of reflection, the pain remained. Marcus was gone, leaving a void that nothing, not even the proudest memories, could entirely fill. Rex's gentle whimpering echoed softly through the chapel again, breaking Margaret's heart once more. She knelt beside the casket, whispering softly, "I promise we'll take care of you, Rex. You're not alone. We'll get through this together." Rex looked up at Margaret with those soulful eyes, intelligent and sorrowful, as though he understood every word. For a moment, something passed between them, an unspoken promise. perhaps a silent understanding that though Marcus was gone, they weren't alone. Margaret took a deep breath, forcing herself to regain composure as tears silently rolled down her face. She gently rested her hand on Rex's soft fur, feeling the rhythmic beating of his heart beneath her fingertips. This wasn't just loss. It was a reminder that bonds built on trust, respect, and love were stronger than any barrier, even death itself. This was a bond unbroken, a love that survived in every heartbeat, every memory, every whispered promise. Yet, little did they know, an event was about to unfold that would make everyone question the very boundaries of life and death. Because what Rex sensed next would defy explanation, forever changing the way they understood their loss, their love, and the unbreakable bond between a soldier and his loyal companion. The chapel was bathed in a pale, gentle glow from sunlight streaming through stained glass windows, casting pools of color across Marcus's casket. The mourners remained hushed, still affected by the poignant scene they'd just witnessed. But Rex, whose sorrowful whimpering had silenced everyone moments earlier, suddenly shifted. With his head resting against Marcus's unmoving chest, Rex abruptly lifted his gaze, his deep brown eyes fixed intently on something invisible to the rest of the room. His ears stood tall, alert, attentive to some unseen presence. The entire chapel seemed to hold its breath as everyone stared, trying to understand what Rex was sensing. Margaret noticed the sudden shift immediately. Her heart quickened, a chill running down her spine. Her voice barely rose above a whisper as she gently reached out. "Rex, what is it, boy?" Rex didn't respond. Instead, his body stiffened even further, his eyes locked onto the empty space near the altar. The air seemed charged, thick with anticipation, and Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something remarkable was occurring, something beyond their comprehension. "What's going on?" whispered Sergeant Jameson, his voice tinged with awe and uncertainty. He glanced around the chapel, but nothing seemed out of place. The chaplain stepped forward, eyes widening slightly in recognition. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, a whisper so low it almost seemed more for himself than for anyone else. "Sometimes dogs see what we cannot." Margaret felt her throat tighten. She wasn't sure what she believed, but the calm intensity in Rex's gaze was undeniable. She glanced around the chapel, noting the reactions from Marcus's fellow soldiers. They exchanged uneasy glances, their stoic composure beginning to slip in the face of Rex's unusual behavior. Sergeant Jameson spoke up cautiously. "Is he seeing something?" Margaret didn't answer right away. Her thoughts raced, recalling stories she'd heard over the years. Stories from families who'd lost loved ones, who'd sworn they'd felt their presence, seen shadows, felt comforting touches. She'd always brushed off such stories as wishful thinking, but now, standing in this chapel, with grief so thick it felt tangible, she began to wonder. Rex suddenly exhaled deeply, as if releasing tension he'd been holding since entering the chapel. His ears twitched subtly, and then he let out a soft, gentle whimper. This time, different, calmer. Margaret's heart raced as she realized what it meant. Whatever Rex had sensed, whatever he'd seen, had brought him comfort. His tail gently tapped once against the side of the casket, a subtle acknowledgement. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the moment passed. Rex slowly lowered his head, turning back to Marcus's still form. He nudged his handler gently one last time, a final, sorrowful gesture of goodbye. Margaret stepped closer, placing a comforting hand on Rex's fur, feeling his body slowly relax beneath her touch. "You've done enough, Rex," Margaret whispered softly, fighting back tears. "You can rest now." But the mourners weren't ready to move on yet. They were still processing the inexplicable moment they had just witnessed. Sergeant Jameson stood frozen, his eyes wide with wonder, clearly wrestling with his thoughts. The chaplain, however, quietly approached Margaret, his voice gentle and soothing. "In times like these," he murmured softly, "we find comfort in many forms. Perhaps Rex was granted a moment we weren't meant to fully understand, one last connection beyond our comprehension." Margaret swallowed hard, nodding slowly, grateful for the chaplain's comforting presence. She knelt beside Rex, pressing her fingers gently into his fur, absorbing the warmth that radiated from his body. "Maybe love doesn't just disappear," she whispered, mostly to herself. Maybe it lingers, stronger than we know. As the mourners began whispering quietly among themselves, the quiet dignity of the chapel returned. But Margaret's mind was racing, heart beating in a new rhythm, a rhythm of hope. Rex's breathing steadied, now quieter, calmer. Margaret knelt by his side, feeling the gentle rise and fall of his chest beneath her fingertips. She whispered again, softly so only he could hear. "You felt him too, didn't you?" Rex gently lifted his eyes, meeting Margaret's gaze. In that instant, the connection they shared felt deeper, stronger, bound by the memory and spirit of Marcus himself. Margaret knew, in that moment, that no matter what happened next, she wasn't alone. Marcus was gone, but his love remained, woven tightly into the hearts of those he left behind, especially Rex, his loyal partner, who had bravely stood beside him through danger, war, and now, even in death. But little did they know, this was not the end. Something else was coming, something that would transform their understanding of loss, love, and loyalty forever. This moment of grief and quiet reflection was only the beginning of something extraordinary, a revelation no one in that chapel could possibly have imagined. The atmosphere in the chapel grew heavy, each second seemingly lasting an eternity. Margaret gently stroked Rex's fur, feeling his steady breathing beneath her palm. Yet, despite the comfort of touch, her mind raced, filled with thoughts of what had just happened. Rex had seen something, felt something, that no one else could. The murmurs in the chapel gradually subsided, replaced by an almost reverent silence. Soldiers who had stood firm throughout the funeral now glanced at one another uncertainly. Even Sergeant Jameson, a battle-hardened veteran, seemed at a loss for words. "What did you see, Rex?" Margaret whispered softly, more to herself than the dog. Her voice was barely audible, but Rex shifted slightly, his ears twitching in response. Slowly, deliberately, Rex raised his head again, his eyes narrowing as he stared beyond the casket into the empty space near the altar. His posture became rigid, focused, as if he were tracking something moving, something invisible yet undeniably present. The chaplain cleared his throat, his voice calm yet tinged with awe. "You see him, don't you, Rex?" Margaret turned sharply toward the chaplain. His expression was calm, compassionate, but his eyes revealed something deeper, a quiet belief, perhaps even reverence. "Do you think," Margaret hesitated, her throat tightening, "do you think it's Marcus?" The chaplain gave a slow nod, his voice gentle yet assured. "I've seen many strange things in this line of work. Dogs sense what we can't. They feel emotions, energies. Perhaps, for a brief moment, Marcus came to say goodbye." The chapel fell into absolute silence as the soldiers absorbed the chaplain's words. Sergeant Jameson, a hardened veteran, cleared his throat, attempting to mask his emotions. "Marcus was the bravest soldier I knew. If anyone could find a way back, even if just for a moment, it'd be him." Margaret felt a chill ripple down her spine. Her brother, so courageous, so selfless, could he really be here in some way? Her rational mind wrestled with the idea, yet her heart embraced it without question. Her voice trembled slightly. Maybe he needed to say goodbye too. Rex's tail gave a gentle, barely noticeable wag, a subtle but profound acknowledgement. Margaret inhaled sharply, her heart beating faster as she stared into the empty space. She whispered softly, "Marcus, if you're really here, we love you, we always will." Around her, the soldiers, usually so disciplined, began shifting uncomfortably, exchanging glances that spoke louder than words. Sergeant Jameson cleared his throat again, voice hoarse. "What if Rex is trying to tell us something?" Margaret turned, looking at Jameson. "What do you mean?" Jameson hesitated, his eyes thoughtful. "Maybe he's telling us Marcus isn't gone, not completely, not as long as we remember him, not as long as we hold on to what he stood for." The chaplain nodded solemnly. "Exactly. True bonds, those built on love and sacrifice, aren't easily broken. Death doesn't erase those ties, it strengthens them." Margaret looked again at Rex. The dog had not moved from his watchful position. His brown eyes remained fixed on something only he could perceive. His body was poised, alert yet calm, as if he were being gently reassured. Margaret's chest tightened, the weight of grief replaced by a strange sense of peace. "Rex, is he here? Is Marcus really here?" In response, Rex released another soft whimper, but this one carried a different tone, a gentle acknowledgement, peaceful yet powerful. Then, as quickly as the moment had begun, it ended. Rex relaxed, his body slowly loosening, the intensity leaving his gaze. Whatever presence had captivated him faded, leaving only the quiet chapel and the mournful yet comforting memory of what had occurred. Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were no longer only tears of loss. They were mixed with gratitude, hope, and a deep, unshakable certainty that Marcus's spirit, his love, had indeed visited them, even if only briefly. With gentle care, Margaret hugged Rex closer, whispering softly, "Marcus chose you for a reason, Rex. You were his protector in life, and even now you protect his memory." The chaplain stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Maybe it's time to let him rest, both of them." Margaret nodded slowly, wiping her tears as she gently guided Rex away from the casket. But as they turned to walk out of the chapel, Rex paused one last time. He looked back over his shoulder toward the empty space near Marcus's casket, his tail wagging slightly, as if saying a final goodbye. A deep peace settled over Margaret, and for the first time since receiving the devastating news, she felt warmth, a gentle reassurance in her heart that her brother was not truly gone. He was still here, watching over them, over Rex. And though his voice was silent, his presence had spoken volumes. They stepped outside, sunlight gently washing over them. Rex pressed closely against Margaret's leg, his warmth comforting her. A gentle breeze rustled through the leaves of nearby trees, and Margaret felt something within her stir, a sense of quiet, unspoken assurance. Maybe some bonds truly were unbreakable. Maybe death didn't have the final say. And maybe, just maybe, Marcus Thompson hadn't truly left them after all. Outside the chapel, the day had transformed into one of serene warmth, with sunlight cascading gently over the manicured lawns of the cemetery. Rows of white tombstones stood solemnly, silent reminders of heroes who, like Marcus Thompson, had given their all for a nation they loved dearly. Margaret walked slowly, her hand resting gently atop Rex's broad head. She could feel the slight tremble in the loyal canine's body, an echo of the emotional turmoil both had just experienced inside. Around them, Marcus's fellow soldiers had gathered, forming a respectful circle near the gravesite. Each stood rigid, their postures disciplined and their expressions stoic, yet their eyes betrayed profound sorrow. In front of the gathered mourners, the honor guard stood ready, crisp and motionless, their uniforms impeccable, the gleaming brass of their buttons reflecting the afternoon sun. Sergeant Jameson gave a slight nod, signaling the honor guard to proceed. The soldiers moved in perfect unison, lifting the American flag gently from Marcus's casket. They held the flag reverently, folding it with meticulous precision, each movement solemn, respectful, a final gesture of gratitude toward a man who had given everything for his country. As the folds became tighter, Margaret felt her throat constrict. Beside her, Rex sat quietly, his ears erect, his eyes never straying from the ceremony unfolding before him. When the flag was finally folded, sharp and precise, one soldier stepped forward. He moved deliberately toward Margaret, holding the symbol of sacrifice reverently in his gloved hands. "On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation," he said, voice strong yet gentle, "please accept this flag as a symbol of appreciation for Sergeant Marcus Thompson's honorable and faithful service." Margaret accepted the flag, her hands trembling as her fingers brushed against the fabric. She clutched it to her chest, the weight of its significance far heavier than she expected. The flag was more than cloth. It was Marcus, his bravery, his laughter, his unwavering spirit. As Margaret struggled to control her emotions, a sharp crack broke the silence, the beginning of the 21-gun salute. The loud, synchronized shots echoed across the cemetery grounds, each volley shaking the air and resonating through the hearts of everyone present. Margaret flinched at each burst of gunfire, gripping the flag even tighter, but Rex remained motionless, unflinching, his eyes locked on Marcus's casket as though standing guard one final time. Then, softly at first, came the haunting sound of taps, the mournful notes echoing clearly through the still air. Each note pierced Margaret's heart, reverberating deep within her, a reminder of the finality she wasn't yet ready to accept. Rex's ears twitched slightly, the sound clearly affecting him too. His body tensed, and his breathing quickened, as if recognizing that this song was the last goodbye. As the last note faded into silence, something incredible happened. Rex, who had sat stoically throughout the ceremony, suddenly rose, moving purposefully toward Marcus's casket. Margaret watched in awe as the German shepherd stopped beside the polished wood coffin, his gaze fixed firmly upon it. For a moment, the gathered mourners seemed uncertain, glancing among themselves, unsure if they should intervene. But Margaret shook her head subtly, silently urging them to let Rex have this final moment. And then, with breathtaking deliberation, Rex lifted his paw and placed it gently, reverently, onto the casket. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried profound meaning. A silent salute, an act of respect, and a heartfelt goodbye. The soldiers watching seemed to collectively catch their breath, their eyes moistening, moved by the purity of Rex's loyalty. Margaret felt tears spill freely down her face now, no longer restrained. Her voice came in a shaky whisper. "He's saying goodbye." Sergeant Jameson, standing close by, nodded solemnly, his voice thick with emotion. No bond stronger than a soldier and his partner. Even now, Rex won't leave Marcus's side. Rex lowered his paw slowly, standing beside the casket one last time, as though reluctant to part from the man he'd protected for so long. The silence stretched painfully, each second marked by a depth of grief that everyone present felt keenly. Rex finally stepped back, his posture dignified yet visibly deflated. Margaret knelt beside him again, her fingers gently combing through his fur. The chaplain stepped forward, softly breaking the poignant silence. "We honor Marcus today, not just for his bravery and service, but for the profound bond he shared with Rex. Their partnership is a testament to loyalty, bravery, and love, a bond even death cannot sever." Margaret nodded slowly, wiping her cheeks, her gaze meeting those of the soldiers around her. Sergeant Jameson, his own eyes glistening, stepped closer and placed a supportive hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Marcus would have been proud of Rex today," he murmured softly. Margaret nodded, her voice gentle but firm. "I know he is." As the mourners dispersed, Margaret stayed beside Rex, the folded flag still tightly clutched against her chest. The wind rustled gently through nearby trees, carrying with it a quiet sense of peace, a lingering assurance. And as she watched Rex stare out into the distance one last time, she wondered again if perhaps Marcus was there, just beyond sight, beyond touch, but forever present in the bonds that death could never break. Margaret stood slowly, gently guiding Rex toward the path leading away from Marcus's final resting place. But as they walked away, she paused one last time, looking back toward the gravesite, her breath catching in her throat. In the breeze, gentle and warm, she felt something familiar, something comforting, like Marcus's hand resting reassuringly on her shoulder, a silent promise that he was still there watching over them. The cemetery slowly emptied, leaving Margaret and Rex alone in the softening sunlight. The weight of the folded American flag in Margaret's arms felt heavier with each passing second, a symbol of sacrifice that seemed to anchor her to this painful reality. She watched as the mourners departed, soldiers offering solemn nods, their eyes carrying sorrowful respect. Eventually, it was just the two of them, standing quietly at the edge of Marcus's freshly covered grave. Margaret inhaled slowly, the ache of loss deepening in her chest as she stared at the polished granite headstone now marking Marcus Thompson's final resting place. He had been a protector, a hero, a brother, and now he was gone, leaving only silence and the haunting memory of what might have been. Beside her, Rex remained still, his posture dignified but weary, the proud stance he had maintained throughout the funeral slowly softening into quiet resignation. Margaret knelt beside him, gently placing the folded flag onto her lap, freeing her hands to run lovingly through Rex's thick fur. "He's really gone, Rex," she murmured softly, her voice breaking slightly. "I wish I could explain it to you that he's not coming back." Rex tilted his head, ears flicking gently, but his gaze remained fixed on Marcus's gravestone. Margaret wondered if he truly understood. How do you explain death to someone who has known nothing but loyalty, companionship, and devotion? She swallowed hard, her fingers gently tracing through Rex's soft coat, feeling his warmth beneath her fingertips. "Marcus always talked about you like family," she whispered, her throat tightening. "He used to joke that you understood him better than I ever did." Margaret's tears came silently, slowly tracing the curves of her face. She glanced at the folded flag once more, a profound sense of gratitude and sorrow washing over her in waves. "He gave his life for so many others," she whispered softly, "but he didn't deserve this, not this." Beside her, Rex let out a quiet sigh, as though finally beginning to grasp the permanence of this moment. His muscular frame sagged slightly, his body no longer holding the rigid discipline he'd shown during the ceremony. He gently lowered himself to the grass, his head resting on his paws, eyes still locked onto the gravestone. Margaret knelt beside Rex, gently placing the flag down and wrapping her arms around the loyal dog. Rex relaxed into her embrace, his breathing softening as though taking comfort in her closeness. Together they shared the silence, grief flowing freely, but also bringing with it an unexpected peace. They had both lost something irreplaceable. Yet, in their shared grief, a new bond formed, a promise to honor Marcus's memory together, to care for one another, to remember that love, loyalty, and courage could endure beyond life itself. Margaret glanced around the quiet cemetery, the sunlight casting long, gentle shadows over the rows of graves. She slowly rose to her feet, clutching the folded flag to her heart, and looked down at Rex. "Let's go home, Rex," she said softly, trying to sound stronger than she felt. At first, Rex didn't move. Instead, he lingered, watching Marcus's grave, ears slightly lowered, tail unmoving. Margaret felt her throat tighten again, understanding his reluctance. Gently, she placed a comforting hand on his head. "We'll never forget him, I promise you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "But Marcus would want us to move forward, together." Rex's gaze slowly shifted from the gravestone to Margaret's face. His eyes, so full of depth, loyalty, and sadness, seemed to understand. Then, with quiet dignity, he rose, standing tall at Margaret's side. As they began walking away, Rex stopped suddenly. He turned back, ears perked and alert. Margaret held her breath, watching closely. Rex stared intently at the empty space beside Marcus's grave, as though seeing someone there. Then, with a gentle, almost imperceptible wag of his tail, he finally turned away, falling into step beside Margaret again. Margaret felt a chill ripple down her spine, yet it was not cold or frightening. Instead, it carried the warmth of familiarity, a gentle reassurance that Marcus wasn't truly gone, just hidden beyond sight, forever part of them both. She glanced back one last time, her heart heavy yet comforted by the certainty that her brother's spirit lived on, not just in memories or mementos, but in the bond between her and Rex, a bond forged in loyalty, strengthened by loss, and unbroken even in death. They walked quietly, their shadows growing longer as the sun sank lower in the sky. Margaret reached down and touched Rex's fur gently, feeling a calm strength in his steady presence. They would carry on, they would honor Marcus's memory, and even though grief still hung heavily over them, they knew they weren't alone. For as long as they had each other, Marcus's spirit would remain alive, unseen but deeply felt, forever part of an unbreakable bond. As Margaret and Rex arrived home, the familiar surroundings felt strangely distant, as though the comforting walls had become unfamiliar in the wake of their loss. Margaret placed the folded flag gently on the living room mantel, carefully positioning it beneath a framed photo of Marcus smiling proudly in uniform. She stepped back, heart heavy with grief, eyes clouded by tears, and yet the small shrine brought a sense of comfort. Rex wandered quietly around the room, sniffing at familiar spots, pausing occasionally to glance toward Margaret as if awaiting guidance. His posture was subdued, ears drooped slightly, a visible reflection of his sorrow. Margaret sat on the sofa, patting the space beside her softly. "Come here, boy," she whispered. Rex moved slowly, climbing onto the couch and curling up beside her, pressing his warm body close. His presence was a comforting anchor amidst the waves of grief threatening to pull Margaret under. She ran her fingers gently through his fur, speaking softly. "Marcus always said you were more than a partner. You were his best friend. You gave him courage when he needed it most." Her voice cracked with emotion. I see why he loved you so much." Rex nudged her hand, a gentle reassurance that he understood her words, or at least the sentiment behind them. They sat quietly for a while, comforted by each other's presence, each lost in memories of the man they'd both loved deeply. Margaret's gaze drifted again toward the folded flag. "Marcus always knew how to find hope even in the darkest moments," she murmured softly. "Maybe we should try to do the same." Rex raised his head, gazing into her eyes as though he understood her words perfectly. She sighed deeply, feeling a sense of resolve growing within her. "It's not going to be easy, but we'll find a way, Rex. We'll honor Marcus by living the way he'd want us to. Strong, proud, brave." Rex's ears perked slightly, and Margaret smiled softly. "You understand, don't you?" As she spoke, her phone vibrated on the coffee table, breaking the peaceful quiet. Margaret reached over and picked it up, reading the incoming text message. It was Sergeant Jameson. "Margaret, the platoon is getting together at Fort Carson tonight to honor Marcus. We'd like you and Rex to come. He'd want you there." Margaret paused, hesitating for only a moment before typing back, "We'll be there." Setting her phone down, she exhaled slowly, squeezing Rex gently. "Looks like we're not the only ones who miss him." She stood up, Rex following closely, his eyes watching her movements with keen curiosity. Margaret walked toward the large window overlooking the backyard, her thoughts drifting once more to Marcus's dream. A small house by a lake, quiet days spent fishing, Rex sleeping peacefully at his side. It was a simple dream, yet now forever unreachable. But perhaps she could still honor it. She turned to Rex, determination strengthening her voice. Marcus wanted peace. He wanted a life filled with purpose and meaning, away from the chaos. Maybe we can still find that peace, Rex. We owe it to him. Rex sat upright, his posture straightening as if responding to her resolve. Margaret felt an unexpected wave of comfort in that silent response. The path forward wasn't clear yet, but knowing she had Rex beside her made it seem possible. The afternoon light slowly faded, casting long shadows across the room, but the darkness no longer felt overwhelming. Instead, it was calm, soothing even. Margaret felt Marcus's presence strongly now, not as a painful absence, but as a comforting whisper in her heart, gently encouraging her to keep moving forward. "Come on, Rex," she finally said, glancing down at her loyal companion. "Let's go see the others. Marcus wouldn't want us hiding away." Rex stood, shaking himself gently before moving toward the front door, tail wagging softly, ready to follow Margaret wherever she led. As they stepped outside, Margaret paused one last time to glance back at the mantel, at the photo of Marcus, smiling back at her. A calm certainty filled her chest. "Goodbye for now, Marcus," she whispered. "We'll carry you with us always." The words lingered in the quiet house as Margaret closed the door softly behind her, stepping into the evening air, Rex close at her side. Their steps were steady, unified. The grief was still there, but it was changing shape now, transforming from overwhelming loss to quiet determination. As they walked together toward Fort Carson, toward Marcus's brothers in arms waiting to grieve alongside them, Margaret felt the gentle reassurance she'd sensed earlier in the chapel. Marcus's presence was there again, invisible but undeniably close, comforting, guiding, and unbroken by death. Margaret smiled softly through fresh tears, whispering quietly, "We'll carry you forward, Marcus. You won't be forgotten." And together, woman and dog, bound by love, loyalty, and shared loss, walked forward into a future uncertain but undeniably filled with hope. Marcus's legacy would live on, not just in memory, but through the unbreakable bonds he had forged, stronger even than death.